Good morning. Yes, we were talking yesterday about Daniel and his interpretation of a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And because of his interpretation of that dream, he is truly made the chief magi. He becomes the prime minister of Babylon. An amazing thing for this young man. Nebuchadnezzar appoints him as chief magi. Well, Daniel and his companions who had been taken away into captivity had many ups and downs in their lives that they had there. But when he's an old man, suddenly Nebuchadnezzar himself dies, and his son takes over from him. Son was now in charge of Babylon itself. And the son heard about a strange new army developing, a new empire developing, under a great ruler called Cyrus, but he couldn't be bothered with him. After all, Babylon was a fortified city, and you couldn't do much with it. It is said of Babylon, for instance, that the wall was so thick you could have chariot races across the top of them, almost 4 chariots wide. You could race across the top of Babylon. It stood within the Euphrates, so the Euphrates River brought water in one side, took the refuse out the other side, and surrounded the city with this great big moat that people could not cross. The son, Belshazzar, who was the son of Nebuchadnezzar, thought he was quite safe and nothing could possibly touch him within the city. And on one occasion, he decides he's going to have a party. Yes, he knows about Cyrus's army milling around the place, doesn't bother with it. Nothing can possibly touch him. He decides to have a party. And there in that particular party, he suddenly sends, and this was his big mistake, he suddenly sends and takes from the treasury those articles which have been taken by Nebuchadnezzar from the temple in Jerusalem. And in the party, with 1,000 of his nobles and lords, he celebrates this great event, that he is now emperor and now in charge of Babylon. And while they're partying, suddenly something strange happens. A hand appears from nowhere and writes in the plaster on the wall, and writes words in the plaster, and then disappears. Belshazzar is terrified, doesn't know what to make of it. He calls people, he says, "What do those words mean?" Nobody knows what they mean. And then his mother comes to him and says, in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, the chief magi who came from Israel, from Jerusalem originally, he could interpret these things. And Daniel is brought in, and he looks up and he looks at the words that have been written. And Belshazzar says, "Do you understand what they mean?" And he says, "Yes, I do." He says the words spell out words, mene, tekel, parsin. That's what they spell out. And Belshazzar says to him, "But what does that mean?" And Daniel says, "Well, mene, it says that God has weighed you in the balance and found you wanting. Tekel, it means quite simply, God has taken the kingdom away from you. Parsin, it means he's given it to the Medes and the Persians." Strange thing for him to say. Belshazzar is terrified, absolutely terrified, by the sign of this hand and what is actually written. But he still honors Daniel, and Daniel is now still the chief magi. Now that night, something strange happens. See, Cyrus had wanted to attack Babylon, but realized that it was too heavily fortified. But his general comes up with a great plan. And what they do, quite simply, is they go upriver and they divert the Euphrates. They dig a large channel, first of all, and then they block the river itself and divert the water into this new channel. Wouldn't last long, because the Euphrates, being a powerful river, would overcome it very quickly. But for a while, the main waters of the Euphrates have been diverted. And when his army came down at night, Cyrus's army that is, they found they could literally walk into the city, because the water, the Euphrates arriving at Babylon, was just about waist deep. And they could walk underneath the wall into Babylon. And Babylon was in fact taken over by Cyrus's army without any battle being fought at all. Belshazzar himself, being the king of Babylon, was killed. But the following day, it is said, but a week afterwards, such a large city, people didn't know that Cyrus had taken over the city. They didn't know that there had been a change of government. This is something which was happening, which were alongside them without them being aware of it. But then, of course, Cyrus turns up. His general has taken the city for him, and Cyrus himself turns up and comes into the city as the new ruler. When he comes into the city, the different dignitaries in the city come and offer him allegiance. They come and say, you are the new king. We accept you, king. We are the people running the city. And Cyrus would quite simply say to them, well, carry on what you're doing. I am now the new king. All you have to do now is come to me and accept my authority, which they would do. And then finally, they say, oh, by the way, the chief magi would also come and offer his allegiance. And that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow.